Hey Danny, how are you? Ooh, you can turkey. You're daring. I always worry about botulism actually with meat. Hey Rebecca, Chicago, Barbara, Northern California, 75 degrees. It's definitely turning winter here. Hey everybody. It's so good to see you again. I hope you all had a good holiday. We did, but it's weird to have your schedule thrown off that much. At least I find it as I get older. Oh, Homer, Alaska. Hey Janet. I've been in Homer many years ago. 4 feet of fresh snow, and that's why I don't live in Homer, Alaska, right there. Um, so I see that there's been another school shooting. I've been at meetings all day. I have not read about that, so I won't talk about that today, except to deplore it, as we all do. Hey Michelle, good to see you. Um, all right, so let me get into some of the material that you asked about today. And as I say, I've been at meetings all day, so I haven't been able to research a lot of stuff the way I normally would. But I'm going to go ahead and keep an eye on the comments that you make in the hopes that maybe I can answer some stuff as it comes up. So let me start with a funny place, I think, to start. And that is a couple of you, at least when I was walking from campus and reading my phone, asked why you feel tired all the time. And the reality is, I'm not sure if you really meant that or if it was just sort of, I feel like I'm exhausted all the time, like so many of us do. But I actually want to answer that in a political context today, and to say that the reason that you feel exhausted about politics is because the way we are doing politics right now is designed to make you feel exhausted. And what I mean by that is that this is a technique that Trump really perfected, although he had it going into his presidency, but that he really used when he was president to go ahead and make sure that people couldn't resist him. And the way that people do this is to create chaos, and to do so by what we call gaslighting. And what that means is to constantly challenge you. It's actually a term that comes from an old movie called Gaslight, in which a man is trying to convince his wife that she is mentally unstable. And he does that by turning down the lights, the gas lights in their home. And so she keeps thinking everything's dim, and he keeps going like, "What's wrong with you? Everything's fine." And she starts to doubt her own reality. And so if you think about, for example, what the first thing that Donald Trump did when he got into office was to argue that his inaugural crowd was bigger than Barack Obama's. And you could see with your own eyes that that was not true. And he wouldn't let it go. And, some people thought it was funny, and they're like, this is just stupid. What a crazy thing to be worried about. But what that does is, if I say to you that your reality is not true and that mine is true, and I force you to accept that, I asserted dominance over you. I've said, it's my reality that matters, not yours. Think of that old skit about. And so the trick to destabilizing a political system is constantly to make you unsure of where the ground is, constantly to gaslight you, constantly to say the opposite of something is true than what really is true. And you see this again and again on the Republican side of the aisle. And I'm going to say something about that in a minute, where people will accuse other people of doing what they're doing. And this is a technique, actually, that the Republicans have been using since George W. Bush. So for example, Representative Lauren Boebert from Colorado has been accusing the congresswoman from Minnesota of being a terrorist, palling around terrorists, being an extremist and all that. Of course, all that's true of Boebert, not the other way around. She's the one who's been hanging out with the 3%ers and with the alt-right, and not the woman that she is accusing of that. But if you're listening to that and you don't really know the facts, you sort of get to the point where you're like, it's too much for me. I don't know what to think. So, for example, I was thinking about things ways to explain this. It's exhausting. So imagine going to the supermarket, and every time you go to the supermarket, they've moved where everything is. You don't have any idea where the milk is one day to the next. And it takes enormous amounts of mental energy. And what this does is it enables a dictator essentially, or an authoritarian, to take order, because what they do is they say, you can't trust anybody, but you can trust me, because I'm going to bring stability back. And I'm going to bring stability back by blaming those people. And one of the people that they always go after are immigrants. And that's just a across the board thing. Think of the rise of Orban in Hungary, Bolsonaro in Brazil, what's his name, Lukashenko in Belarus, or Donald Trump in America. They say, blame those people. They're not like you. And certainly there are other people that they could blame, but almost always immigrants are involved. And people who are exhausted, either they do one of two things. They either say, I can't think anymore. I can't watch anymore. I'm just going to go tune it all out. Or they say, I need someone to guide me out of this. And they become prime fodder for the rise of an authoritarian. And this is theorized, if anybody's interested, in places like Hannah Arendt or in people like Eric Hoffer. And Eric Hoffer's True Believers is a great read. It's available, I think it's available online in a PDF. And I urge anybody who's interested in this to read it. So the reason you're tired is because you're supposed to be tired. That's what this constant barrage of lies and all that is supposed to be. Now, the next question that you didn't ask is, how can you stop being so tired? And I mean, obviously, the taking care of yourself physically is eating right and sleeping and all that. And let me tell you, this is physician heal thyself, right? I neither eat well nor sleep as much as I should. And I do try and exercise, but I don't get as much as I should. But all those things you're supposed to do. But I can't talk about any of that. I'm not a doctor or anything. But what you can do psychologically are a few things. First of all, remember that there are things that are true. There are things that you know about yourself. You know what your principles are. You know who you love. You know experiences you had. Those things happened. And it's hard to sort those out. The more you get confused about the world around you, it's harder and harder to sort those out. But they did happen, and you can remember that they happened, and you can look at photographs and remember that they happened, and you can remember who you are, what you care about. We're not at a point necessarily yet where we're at that stage where you need to do that. But and certainly George Orwell talks a lot about things like that and how you retain that kind of memory in a really serious authoritarian system. But for right now, one of the things that I do, two things that help me, three things. One is to remember you're not alone. You know, I see these emails or messages all the time saying, why is nobody doing X? Well, the answer is lots of people are doing X. You know, why are people not passing the Voting Rights Act, which I'm going to talk about in a minute? A lot of people are fighting for that. You're not alone, and it's totally okay to take a break and let other people carry on for a while. You know, just stop for a while. Don't pay attention any longer and rejuvenate. That's totally okay to do. So recognize you're not the only one, and then also in terms of rejuvenation, do it. You know, do what you love. You know, if you need a break, my big thing is cooking and knitting and obviously kayaking. Do it, and do enough of that it grounds you again. Those things are all fine to do. And the final thing that I do is, and this sounds dumb too, I remember that as horrifying as things seem today, think about when in America we had a generation that didn't have to take on something horrible. So perhaps the people like me, the boomers, haven't had to deal with it yet. We're dealing with it now. But, you know, the people who lived through the Depression did not want to live through the Depression. That was not like they signed up for that. World War II. You know, in 1943, who knew how that was going to turn out? World War I, certainly the 20s, any of the periods in American history, there was never any guarantee that those were going to turn out okay. And yet you got through them by putting one foot in front of the other. And that's the thing, of course, that Harriet Tubman used to say, you know, in order to be through, in order to get out, you have to go through. And we're in the going through part. And the trick is that, you know, the world is still a beautiful place. And the people around us are still good people. And so to take comfort in that. So that was probably more time than I intended to spend on that. But I just want you to know that it's not that there's something wrong with you, as long as you're physically okay. And I'm not a doctor, I don't know anything about that. But that if you are mentally exhausted, the world is designed, the politics in which the authoritarians are now engaging are designed to make you exhausted. And it's okay to say, I'm just not going to deal with this expletive right now. I'm going to take a break and get my feet back under me. All right, so that was one thing, but now some stuff I want to talk about today. First of all, a lot of you have talked about, and I think reasonably talked about, the fact that the media, not only the right-wing media, but the mainstream media, is not very well dealing with the reality of the Biden administration. And people want to know why. And a lot of people say it's for clicks. Well, it is for clicks, and it's worth knowing that people who write articles for newspapers and magazines do not write their own titles. That's really important to know. So one of the things that it's important to do when you see a crazy title is actually to read the article, because the person who writes the title is put in place by the management to go ahead and make sure that people are going to click on the article, because that's how you get advertising dollars. Now, I should have a little bit of a caveat there. That is not true for my podcast, Joanne's and my podcast. Our producers let us, they're very helpful, but they don't force us to have a title that we don't want to have. So there are places where people do have creative control, but that's a little bit different than when you're writing, for example, for the the Washington Post, right? Where somebody's just going to make a title and then you're like, oh, that's interesting. That's not quite what I said, but okay. So part of it is for clicks, but part of it, I think there's two other things going on. Part of it is that there's this constant search for something new, and it's easy to get dragged into the daily minutia. So for example, the negotiations over the Build Back Better bill, which is the larger infrastructure package that is currently in front of the Senate. I told you I wouldn't write about them because they were boring, I thought. And mind you, I wrote an entire book that dealt with economic policies, in which I read every single discussion about how much they should tax sugar, for example. And, so my boredom threshold is pretty high. And I was like, this is crazy. I can't read this. And I think partly people kind of get tied up in, Joe Manchin. So here's a great example. Joe Manchin came out a few weeks, months, or whatever ago, and he gave a press interview, and it got headline news. He said blah, 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 and it means he's dumping whatever. Do you remember that? This is one of the things that I like to do when I decide whether or not a story is important, is to say, if I were writing a history book about this in 100 years, would I write about that? And the answer often is no. This is just normal negotiation and argument, in front of the cameras to try and put pressure on one point or another. And I don't need to know that. Even me, I'm like, I want to know how it comes out. I won't read a story that says something might happen. I just won't read those anymore, because you know what? Lots of things might happen, and my life is too short to worry about what might happen. I do read the stories that say this pattern suggests the next thing is X. That's a very different kind of thing. So it's partly clicks. It's partly that they're always looking for something new. It's partly that the funding of our newsrooms has declined to the point that they can't have the really deeply researched and deeply experienced reporters the way, for example, many of the European papers still can. So there's a really big difference when I talk to European reporters from when I talk to American reporters. And that's not a reflection on intelligence or anything else, a reflection on how many people are in the newsroom and how quickly they have to move, and whether or not they can do things like take really deep dives. And a lot of American reporters simply can't do that. But then I think there's another piece. And I think the other piece is that it's not been cool for a long time to talk about what we believe in. It's been cool always to knock people down, because think about that. And Teddy Roosevelt, by the way, talked about that. If you are simply complaining about something or finding the negative, you're not putting your heart on the line. You're saying, I'm too cool to be crushed by this. I don't trust this. I don't trust anything. And going ahead and talking about things positively requires that you put your heart on the line. And it's not safe in America and a lot of places to put your heart on the line because people don't have faith in that any longer. Um, and it's, they're worried they're going to get made fun of, or they're worried that somehow they're on the line. And Teddy Roosevelt talks about that. That's when he talks about, if you're if you're the person in the ring, everybody's going to be shooting at you. But surely having the courage to be in that ring means that you should, that people should applaud you for having the courage to do that. And I took that to heart. I like to talk about things I believe in and things that I think go well. And it becomes a habit once you start doing it. But yeah, it then means that you can look like an idiot. And that's just, maybe as an almost 60-year-old woman, I don't care that much about looking like an idiot. So I think part of it is that rather than saying, yeah, this is good, they're always being careful to make sure that nobody can come and say, oh, you said that was good and it wasn't. But the problem, as was pointed out so brilliantly by that journalist I quoted the other day, is that they're actually not giving a real picture of what's happening, because there is good stuff happening. And it's been a long time since there's been good stuff happening. And of course, part of this has been the attempt on the part of right-wing media to go ahead and insist that anytime you said anything good about the government, that you were the left-wing media. So actually, let me do a little bit of a rabbit hole about that, because that also had a theoretical underpinning behind it. What happens is that in the 1950s, when people like William F. Buckley Jr. are trying to go ahead and they're trying to go ahead and get people to reject the New Deal, they have a problem. And Buckley writes about this problem in 1951 in a book called God and Man at Yale, in which he says, we have a problem because every time we actually explain reality to people, they choose the New Deal. They choose liberalism. And so we can't actually explain things to them. We have to start from the premise that this is bad and that the government should only promote what he calls free enterprise and religion and promote the military. And anything other than that is this liberal idea. And by the way, by that he means the liberal consensus that's embraced by Republicans and Democrats both in that World War II period. And so what he does is he argues that a fact-based press, as well as a fact-based academy, the universities, is liberal. And then he turns that into a pejorative. So this is how we get the idea that universities are liberal. He says that about Yale in 1951, which is full of people that we would consider conservative now. They were Republicans. They were embracing many of the old ideas that now would be considered really quite conservative. But the very fact that they were making fact-based arguments meant that he called them liberal. They were the enemy because they were making fact-based arguments. And the same, of course, is true today when people are attacking the universities, which, by the way, they're doing right now in truly horrific ways. You may or may not have seen it. I was attacked this weekend, and it was it wasn't even vaguely fact-based. It was really lots of dog whistles, not even dog whistles, foghorns. And so you have the idea of the liberal university, but also the idea of the liberal media. And after the destruction of the fairness doctrine during the Reagan administration in 1987, increasingly the right-wing media insists that it is fair and balanced. And what it means by that is that it is telling the movement conservative narrative that the government is bad, the New Deal has to be overturned, and that, feminazis and black and brown people and workers are special interests that are trying to bring communism to America. And that is, although that is not fact-based, it is ideologically based. They argue that all the other media needs to include that, or they are just the liberal media. And the liberal media, as they call it, the normal media, the mainstream media, falls for it, and they keep including those voices. So, for example, you see on the Sunday talk shows now, they're overwhelmed with these movement conservatives who don't represent even half of America. And yet, if they don't put those people, the people that are underrepresented are people who are not part of that, what is now an authoritarian movement, who are Republicans or Democrats who do actually believe in having a functioning government, do believe in government regulation, do believe in a basic social safety net, believe in what are actually majority values in this country. So I think part of why the mainstream news media is not presenting the reality of the Biden administration is because they've been conditioned the same way I talked about gaslighting. They have been conditioned to go ahead and not say anything positive about a Democrat, and to be drowned out by those right-wing voices. And so on that level, I want to call out today the fact that the U.S. economic numbers are great. They are great. The inclusion of the child tax credit, that's not what it's called. I'm drawing a blank on it. The child tax credit. Anyway, the inclusion of that in the original American Rescue Plan that Biden and the Democrats passed with no Republican votes almost as soon as Biden got into office, it was in early March of 2021, that has cut childhood, that's cut food insecurity by 24%. 24%. And the other thing that came out, I think it was today, I kind of lost last night, so I'm not sure. One of the reasons that the feds are talking about dialing back the economy some is they are predicting that the growth of this quarter will be 5%. You know, the last time we hit 5% growth for a quarter? The Reagan administration. So, we've got, and the unemployment is the lowest it's been since, I think it's been in 52 years, sometime in the 1960s. Our numbers are spectacular. And you're really not seeing it the way you should. There's stories here and there, but you're not seeing it as a whole. And that's really interesting if you compare it, for example, to the Reagan recovery after many of the problems of the Reagan administration. That was everywhere, the Reagan recovery, right? I'm even calling it that. And that was caused by the extraordinary pumping in of money into the defense industries, although it wasn't billed that way. What you're seeing now is really quite spectacular proof of what the Democrats have been saying since the 1930s, and when they had an economic underpinning of that by John Maynard Keynes. But it's the same thing that the Republicans said way back in first of all, at the turn of the century under Teddy Roosevelt, but also under Abraham Lincoln. And that is that when the government supports people at the bottom, the economy booms, that you build the economy from the bottom up, from the demand side. Because what happens is that if people people get unhappy sometimes when I say ordinary Americans or regular Americans. I consider myself an ordinary American or a regular American. We're just the schmoes on the street, right? We have talents, we're engineers, we're electricians, we're house painters, we're college professors, whatever. But we're not, I don't know about you, but I'm not out there moving around my hundreds of millions of dollars, right? I'm not a captain of industry. So when I say regular Americans, that's what I mean by that. But if you support people like us, through things like the child tax credit, we put that money right back into the economy, and it goes ahead and it builds the economy really quickly. And that is exactly what the Reagan administration argued against. That's why you got the rise of supply side economics, with the argument that if you moved money upward, the people at the top would reinvest it in the economy and they would know where to invest it. So they would go ahead and they would create this booming economy. That never worked. All those tax cuts, which originally when that concept came out, the idea was that you had to do it tinker a little bit around the edges. And of course, now it's just become gospel belief for the Republicans that any problem should be solved by tax cuts, but it doesn't work. So what Biden has done is he's come in and he's said, well, let's try it the way we Democrats believe it works. And lo and behold, best economy since the Reagan administration. And anyway, so when we go back then to why the mainstream media is not reporting that, the other piece of the way that the right went ahead and manipulated the media was that it came up with the concept of the Overton window, which you may have heard of. And the Overton window is really important, not only for the movement to the right, but also to the movement back to the left. And that's that what Thomas Overton argued, and he was at a think tank called the Mackinac Institute. What he argued was that if you went onto television and into the media and you pushed ideas, you kept pushing that envelope, people would say, oh, you're crazy. But what it would do is it would drag the window of what was acceptable further and further to the right. So a great example of this is if you had said, the way people's minds changed, if you had said to many Trump voters in 2016 that he would be behind the January 6th insurrection in 2020, they would have been appalled. They would have been like, no, I don't want to vote for that. But by the time we got there, that sort of behavior had been so normalized, they're like, yeah, this is fine. And the same was true of the right-wing ideas. They kept pushing them and pushing them and pushing them. If you had talked in 1980, for example, about the privatization of public schools, the way people are talking about it now, or the end of Roe versus Wade, or any of the many things that have become at our horizon, back in the 1980s, people would have said, no, that's fascism. No, we wouldn't do that. But now, of course, because of the Overton window, we've gotten there. All right, so that, I think, is why the media is not covering the Biden administration as fairly as it could. Now, that being said, you've also asked about Trump and January 6th and what's going on with the January 6th stuff. And on that, the media is much fairer. So think about that. In that case, the story is negative. So they're actually producing a much more clear story because it is negative, I think. I mean, I could be wrong about this. This is what I watch, so this is what I see. And I also am always loath to accept explanations that are really simple. Sometimes the explanations are simple, but people are complicated, and institutions are even more complicated. So saying, for example, oh, it's just that the news reporters hate Biden. It's not true. I know a lot of news reporters and actually quite like him, but they still write negative stories. So, there's a lot of stuff going on there. All right. So you've asked about what's happening with Trump and the January 6th commission. Lots of people want to know when Trump's going to be arrested. I don't know. It's in the future. But let me tell you what the factors are going into this. First of all, the arrest, not even the arrest, let's not even get to the arrest yet. The indictment of a former president is a really big deal. It's never been done. It's never come up because the only obviously criminal president that we have had, although I'm sorry, I shouldn't say that because I'm still unhappy about Iran-Contra. I'm really unhappy about Iran-Contra, but Nixon, obviously, and Ford pardoned Nixon, and a presidential pardons a get out of jail free card. And as you know, I objected to that pardon. I think that was a huge mistake. I think America went badly off the rails with that because it established the principle that, not the principle, it established the idea, although Archibald Cox said it did just the opposite. I think he was wrong about that. Except that presidents were above the law, and that I think if Nixon had to stand trial, even if he had not been convicted, I don't think we would have had Iran-Contra. I don't think we would have had weapons of mass destruction, and I sure don't think we would have had Donald Trump in the White House, because all of them would have recognized that they could have gone to jail, and they would not have behaved the way they did. So, anyway, so the idea of indicting a former president, any former president, is a big deal. So put yourself in the shoes of a prosecutor or an attorney general. And mind you, I have no inside information on this. I'm telling you, I'm reading the tea leaves. I could be entirely wrong. For all I know, Merrick Garland is on a beach in Tahiti sipping a Mai Tai. I don't believe that's the case because of his past, very impressive past record of doing things like bringing the Oklahoma City bombers to justice. But I don't know. I'm just telling you what I'm seeing. If you are the person that is doing that, you want to have such a clear case that it's open and shut. And the other thing you want to do is you want to make sure that whatever you're doing is insulated from politics. So, for example, you don't want to have everything resting on the January 6th Commission in the House of Representatives, because if the House of Representatives turns over in 2022 to the Republicans, they're going to get rid of that commission so fast it'll make your head spin. So you want to make sure that that is actually insulated enough from politics that Trump's loyalists can't change that. So going ahead and indicting a former president is a big deal anyway. And now you've got a former president who is running an insurrection. I mean, he is not basically, he is running an insurrection in this country. So you want to have your ducks oh so in a row that you're not going to be adding fuel that cannot be doused to an insurrection. So there are a couple of ways to do that. And first of all, one of the things that I haven't written about yet, but I probably will tonight, is the fact that Steve Bannon is demanding that all of the evidence against him be in public. And lots of people are like, yeah, we want hearings. Yeah, we want to know what's going on. Yeah, we want, we feel like we are not being told what's happening. I'm dead against having all that stuff in public. And the fact that Alex Jones and Steve Bannon want their cases to be tried in public, to be seen in public, I don't mean literally legal cases, I mean the information about them, should say everything to you. They want to do two things. They want to make sure that that everybody knows what's going on and has an opinion about it, so they can argue that they can't get a fair trial. And they want to go ahead and try this in the media so that it's not about the law, it's not about what they did, it's about how they can sway public opinion. And both of those men are experts at media. So they're trying to go ahead and move the ball into their own court. I don't think that's going to happen, by the way. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that the whole point of having hearings in secret is, first of all, to go ahead and make sure that you don't hand advantages to of a public opinion to the crazies. And by that, I mean the political crazies. I'm not making statements about anybody's mental health issues. But the Lauren Boeberts of the crowd, or the Marjorie Taylor Greens, or the Matt Gaetzes. So that's one thing. And the other piece of that is that you don't want them to be able to compare stories. So one of the things you're seeing here is they're desperate to have public hearings so they know what each other has said. Because here's the kicker. You may not have seen this, but one of the people who's on the January 6th the select committee to investigate the attack on the Capitol, on the January 6th attack on the Capitol, the U.S. Capitol. It's the longest title in history. Anyway, one of the people on that committee came out and said they've had more than 200 interviews with people who have volunteered to testify. And she also said that some of the people who were subpoenaed did that for cover. Now, she was not under oath. One of the things I want to always remind you is that unless somebody's under oath, they might be telling the truth. They might not be. They might be not telling the truth to gain an advantage. Now, maybe she's telling the truth. I don't know. But think of what that did. If you're listening to that and you did something you shouldn't have on leading up to January 6th or afterward, and she has just said in public, 200 people, you don't know who they are, have been talking to the committee, and that some of those that were subpoenaed, who are really high up the chain, the subpoenas were, did that for cover. You don't know what they know. You have no idea. Maybe they know nothing about you, but maybe they know a lot. And they've dropped some other hints as well about Mark Meadows, for example, who today, Benny Thompson, who's the chair of that committee, said, well, Mark Meadows is cooperating. Why would Mark Meadows be cooperating? Because one of the things that Benny Thompson said a few days, or I don't know, whatever time ago, recently, right, last couple of weeks, is that Mark Meadows refused to say anything, including whether or not he was using a private cell phone and where his texts from that day are. Innocent. But it might mean he knows that they were texts and that Mark Meadows was using a private cell phone. I don't know. I'm just saying, if you read those, where I'm going back to with this is, if you are somebody who might have done something you shouldn't have, you don't know what they've got. And you don't know sorry, every time I do this, my computer goes dark. And so if they keep things secret and they do it behind closed doors, what do they call it? It's a prisoner's dilemma or something. A lot of people are going to want to spill whatever they've got, so they're not the ones who go to jail. And it puts, without anybody doing things in public, it puts enormous pressure on people to make these choices. Now, I want to say something else about that, two things about that before I go on to voting rights. First of all, what I will be writing about tonight is there was a story that dropped this morning from, oh my God, all of a sudden his name went out of my head. The Guardian, Hugo Lowell from The Guardian, that he has sources, plural, who have told him that Trump made phone calls to the war rooms at the Willard. And he made separate ones to his lawyers and to the other people who were there, with the idea that the lawyers would be under attorney-client privilege, although you can't have attorney-client privilege to break a law, but you'd have to prove he'd broken a law. And that he did so from a room in which there was not necessarily going to be records kept. So that's a really big deal, because the Trump administration has tried, the president and his lawyers have tried to say he had nothing to do with anything that happened, nothing to do with that war room, nothing to do with anything else that transpired in that room. And Hugo Lowell said, oh, wait a minute, I've got sources who say he was calling in. That's mega huge. And immediately when the story dropped this morning, early, 9-ish, 8:30-ish, immediately Trump's spokesperson, Liz Harrington, came out and said, that's a lie. Well, okay, I believe that, right? So that's a really big deal. And it indicates the degree to which pressure is ramping up. The Ali Alexander, who was claimed anyway on video to be instrumental in the planning of January 6th, and claimed to be working with 3 Congress people when he did so, although he took that video down. He has said he's going to cooperate with the committee, in part because it looks like he's trying to raise money. But, there's a lot of stuff spilling right now. And I want to add to that as well. You hear this a lot. Nobody ever pays for this. Nobody ever goes to jail. Well, that's not really true. In fact, the Justice Department got a number of Trump's major, his campaign managers, all these people. Trump pardoned them because he was president. But that's not to say that the justice system didn't come after them. And now that he's not president any longer, he's not going to be able to do that. And we also have as well the fact that he is fighting these subpoenas from the National Records Association, NARA. Sorry, I'm tired and I'm missing the acronym, but the National Archives. There we go. It's National Archives and Records Administration. The National Archives. He's fighting those subpoenas that the January 6th committee has made, and it looks pretty much like he's not going to prevail. It's crazy because the law reads that executive privilege is determined by the executive because it doesn't protect the person, it protects the office. And Trump is trying to argue that his desires should override Biden's, and it's hard to imagine that a court's going to go ahead and do that. And obviously he wouldn't be fighting the way he is if there were nothing in them, right? So anyway, all that's what's happening with January 6th. Okay, so now I want to get to another couple of points today, and that is you people have asked a lot about where the Voting Rights Acts stand. And so I want to just reiterate that there were 3 voting rights bills before this particular Congress. House of Representatives number 1 and Senate number 1, For the People Act were that they were identical bills. They would have had to be changed if they had actually gone into the Senate. But what happened was the House of Representatives passed them. Passed the For the People Act. It was a really long bill. It was almost 1,000 pages long, and it had a lot of stuff in it. It was kind of a wish list of things that would clean up American elections. And Joe Manchin, who was a conservative Democrat in the Senate, said, I can't agree to this. There's stuff in this I don't like. I can't agree to this. He was not the only one, by the way, but he was the ringleader. And he said, but I can write a bill that 10 Republicans will agree with. And so he sat down with a group of other Democrats and one independent, Angus King of Maine, and they wrote the Freedom to Vote Act, which came out in either August or September of this year, to great fanfare. Said, we've got this. It's a moderate bill. It does a bunch of ththings that everybody can agree on. It provides standardized rules for voting across all 50 states. It provides for, I haven't seen it in a while. I think it's everybody gets 2 weeks early voting. Everybody gets mail-in voting. You get same-day registration. And it stops the big things that the Republican-dominated states have done since the last election to stop voters. They've suppressed the vote really dramatically, and they have also taken in many states the power of determining election results from nonpartisan election boards and handed them over to Republicans to go ahead and decide how a state votes. Now, if that had happened in Georgia in 2020, Trump would have won the state of Georgia, because his argument was that you should simply throw out all the votes from Fulton County because they were tainted by voter fraud. They were not. There was no evidence of that. But Fulton County is black, largely, and it votes Democratic. So if you throw out all the Democratic votes, the Republican wins. And so a number of Republican-dominated states have done exactly that. They've put that in place going forward so that in the future they will be able simply to say Democratic voting is illegitimate, that they're full of fraud. There's no evidence of this, and therefore we're not going to count those votes. So the For the People Act will get rid of not the For the People Act, the Freedom to Vote Act will get rid of that. And it will also stop partisan gerrymandering. And the partisan gerrymandering that is going on right now is extraordinary. So in places, for example, where Biden won by 49.1% of the vote, in those states, they have divided the voting maps up in such a way that, for example, Republicans will win 78% of the seats. I mean, it's just nuts. It's just off the charts, voter suppression and stealing of elections. So that bill, the For the People Act passed the House, went to the Senate. Joe Manchin said, I can't deal with this, but I'm going to write the Freedom to Vote Act. The Freedom to Vote Act is now in front of the Senate because it's a Senate bill. Now, back even for a debate, the Republicans filibuster it, and they won't even let it come up for a debate. And every Republican has voted against bringing it up for debate, except Lisa Murkowski from Alaska, who quite likes some of the ideas in it. All right, so now I'm going to give you one more, and that is the John Lewis Voting Advancement Act, Voting Rights Advancement Act, John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. And that is a really interesting bill, because that essentially returns the protections for voting to the country that the Supreme Court stripped out with the Shelby v. Holder decision of 2013, which gutted the Voting Rights Act. And what that did is the Voting Rights Act of 1965 said before a state is allowed to change its voting laws, it's got to run it by the Department of Justice, which will say whether or not it's fair. Shelby v. Holder said, we don't need that anymore. We don't have race issues anymore. Everything's just ducky. We're going to go ahead and we're in a post-racial society. And this is when Ruth Bader Ginsburg is like, this is like saying we don't need an umbrella anymore. We're dry under the umbrella. Voting rights advancement. Anyway, so the John Lewis, the baseline we had in 2013. Now, the reason I said that that's interesting, and that was gutted in 2013, and then again further gutted in July of this year when the Supreme Court said, yeah, even if the new state laws privilege one group over another, that's still okay, which is eye-popping. Anyway, so what the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act does is basically return us to the status quo that we had till 2013. Now, the reason I said that was interesting is because the Voting Rights Act of 1965 has had to be renewed a number of times. And the last time it was renewed, I think, was 2006. It might have been 2003. And the Senate voted for that unanimously. 98 senators, and there were none on the other side, 2 people weren't there, 98 senators, all the Republicans, including, I think I shouldn't say how many, it's more than 10 that are still in the Senate who voted for that bill in the 2000s, are now voting against it. So when Mitch McConnell comes out and says, oh, this is this great overreach, no, it's not. So right now, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act has passed the House Both of them are sitting in front of the Senate. So why are they waiting? What's happening there? The issue is that in order to pass those voting rights acts, the Democrats are going to have to do a carve out of the filibuster, which means they're going to have to go ahead and it's a very simple procedure. It's so stupid. They call it the nuclear option, and it's really just kind of a little bunny hop. But what that means is that the Senate periodically does carve out from the filibuster certain areas of legislation. So for example, you can't filibuster certain financial bills, which is what we're talking about when we talk about the reconciliation bills. Those can't be filibustered, and that's what the Republicans are saying the Democrats have to do to raise the debt ceiling, even though $7.8 trillion of that, I think it's $28 trillion debt, were actually incurred by the Republicans in the last 4 years. And now they're like, it's not our problem, you have to deal with it. But you can deal with it, we don't have to vote for it because you can deal with it through reconciliation. And then we can go out on the campaign trail and blame you for raising the debt ceiling, even though we did it 3 times under the Trump administration. Once again, something that the mainstream media hasn't covered very well. But so financial bills aren't covered, certain kinds, not all of them, but certain kinds aren't covered by the filibuster, nor are judicial appointments, including the Supreme Court. And this is one of the things that is I think very important, is that Harry Reid, who was a Democratic Senate Majority Leader, cut the judicial nominations out of the filibuster because under Mitch McConnell, he wasn't letting any of Obama's judicial appointments through. But Harry Reid did not touch Supreme Court appointments, feeling that was important to preserve. And as you know, Mitch McConnell then went ahead and made sure that Obama's Supreme Court nominee, who was Merrick Garland, couldn't even get a hearing. The minute Trump's in office, McConnell went ahead and did a carve out for Supreme Court justices, and that's how we got Trump's 3 Supreme Court justices who barely squeaked by with simple majorities. And so people like me who say, do the freaking carve out for voting rights, say, Mitch McConnell will do a carve out for anything he wants. All he cares about is money and judicial appointments. Those 2 things are not covered by the filibuster. Sure, go ahead and do voting rights, because that's something that the Democrats care about. As you know, I have my doubts about the filibuster anyway. But the other thing that you could do, that the Senate could do, is simply return to the filibuster as it was originally, which was you had to actually hold the floor and talk. You had to put some skin in the game and explain why you didn't want voting rights, for example. And right now, we have this stripped down system where you can just say, I'm going to filibuster that. And that's how the Republicans have stopped so many things. The use of the filibusters have gone absolutely off the charts. So that's where we are on voting rights. And yes, I am hysterical about voting rights, because if we don't have voting rights, we don't have democracy. And we have had that before in America, and that is the American South from the 1870s through 1965, when you have in Mississippi, for example, virtually no Black people registered to vote because their lives were in danger if they did so. So technically there were elections, but the Democrats were always going to win because they terrorized everybody else. And that is exactly what we are looking at happening in America unless we protect our right to vote. And I'm going to say a little bit more about how to do that in a minute. And I want to emphasize here that when I say that, the Republican Party is, the real Republican Party is important. It's an important part of who we are. And its principles, as they were articulated by Abraham Lincoln and his people and Teddy Roosevelt and Eisenhower, are part, like I say, they're part of us, and they're very important to who we are. The idea that the government should support the people at the bottom, and that our social and our economic lives are really a web as opposed to a teeter-totter, if you will, the way they are for the Democrats. They're not opposites. The parties have never been opposites. They're from different ideological moments, different historical moments, and we need both of those things. The current day leaders, and many people write to me and they're like, what happened to my party? Like, your party left you, but those ideas of that party are still really important. Even if you are listening to me and you're like, well, I'm not a Republican, that's fine. We need the Democrats too, but we need at least 2 healthy parties. Right now, since the rise of Donald Trump, the Republican Party has become an authoritarian, the leadership has become an authoritarian party. And they are increasingly radical. And the radicals are gaining power. The very fact that House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy does not dare to say anything about, for example, Lauren Boebert's attacks on a colleague from Minnesota suggesting that she's a terrorist, or the fact that the Republicans would not disavow Paul Gosar's video in which he literally, as an anime character with his face photoshopped on him, kills a Democratic member of Congress, is appalling. Imagine that you had done that, or somebody had done that at your workplace. How long do you think one of your coworkers would have stayed employed had they done that? And not only did they not reprimand him, McCarthy came out and said that he would actually give Gosar and Marjorie Taylor Greene and people like that better committee assignments if they were stripped of their committee assignments. And that shows, I think, that the leadership of the party is, think about, again, talk about the Overton window. Imagine being, and I'm sure some of you listening to me were Reagan Republicans. Imagine how Reagan would have reacted to Paul Gosar. And I'm no fan of Reagan, let me tell you. I mean, you're welcome to be, I am not. But Reagan would never have permitted Paul Gosar to get the support of the Republican Party. He just wouldn't have done it. Nor would George H.W. Bush have done so. So the party has gotten increasingly radical. The same is not true. If you look statistically, the same is not true of the Democrats. People talk about polarization. It's just not there. Look at any statistic. It says basically the Democrats have stayed largely where they are, although they are starting to employ that Overton window themselves, which would be interesting because it might get them back to where they used to be. They've been pulled really far to the right. But what's really happened is that as the Republicans have lost support, lost the popular support, which begins about 1986, they have gone ahead and so significantly suppressed the vote and now gerrymandered that they have given themselves the opportunity to have these extraordinarily safe districts. So the real danger is not that you will lose your district because it's going to vote Republican, just as Marjorie Taylor Greene's did. The issue is that you might get primaried by somebody who is further right than you. So that's moved the party significantly. The reason that I am beside myself over the Voting Rights Acts is that with the Republicans in these Republican-dominated states having gone ahead and guaranteed that a Republican will win, and with the party increasingly radicalizing, where does that go? That goes toward a party that is run by a country that is run not only by minority rule, but also by authoritarian rule. And so does it keep me up at night? Absolutely. So now, as you know, I like to leave people on a positive note. Many people write to me and they're like, what can we do? How are we going to survive living under an authoritarian government? And I would like to answer that with, we are not living under an authoritarian government right now. And there are far more people who don't want to do that than people who do. And by the way, in this, I include many rank and file Republican voters who simply are not paying very close attention. I was at a dinner party with a bunch of them the other night, and they're not engaged at all in politics. And if they really knew what was going on, I think most of them, not all of them, but most of them would be really appalled by where we are, but they're just not paying attention. So what do we need to do? There's the usual. Give to causes you support, work in elections, run for local office, call your senators and representatives and all those things. But the one thing I keep coming back to, because it's the way that I think, and I do study political change, is the way you change politics is by taking up oxygen. By, for example, doing what a man in a huge truck I saw the other day, real muscle truck, Ford 250, flying a giant flag. And I just set that up to make you think, oh, it's a giant flag flying out of the back of his truck. It's a Trump flag, and there's one of those in my town too. No, it was a pride flag. for this guy with all the trappings of everything that goes with a Ford F-250 to be flying a giant pride flag changes the conversation. Exhibiting and embracing the values that you care about and will in fact move the needle. And you've seen this happen again and again, even in the last few years, when enough people step up and say something, people react. Lawmakers react. They would like actually to be reelected. And in order to be reelected, they have to represent what people tell them they want. So changing that public conversation, writing letters to the editor, and putting things on social media that you care about and that are factual, like that really matters to me, that we're actually operating in a fact-based world. But let me add one more piece to that goes right back to where I started with the, how can you face the craziness, the instability of the ground under your feet. And that is, as I said, I think about the other times in American history that people had to deal with things they didn't want to deal with. People who went to college in, 1937 did not expect that they were going to be signing up for a world war. And people who just wanted to have babies, did not think they were going to end up watching their husband march off and never come back. I think about those people and how hard things must have been for them, but they came on through. And I know a lot of those people, and so do you. And it didn't necessarily have to be a war. Maybe it was a plant closing or something, people who kept on going. But I also think about our country and our history and our values and the things that we stand on. And I think about things like the Gettysburg Address. And lots of people, as I say, it's easy to talk about all the things that are wrong. When I talk about the founders, and how they talk about all men being created equal, I always get somebody saying, well, they didn't include slaves. And they rarely say they didn't include women, which is also true. And they certainly didn't include indigenous people. I know that. I wrote a book about that talks about that in great detail. But that idea that we could really create a nation that enables people to determine their own fates and to work together as a community to do that, to do what is best for the most of us, it seems to me is a noble principle. And it's something that is worth dedicating yourself to. And when I think about things like that, I think about the Declaration. But for me, of course, it's the Gettysburg Address. Lincoln gave that, and now we're like, oh, it's the Gettysburg Address. It's really famous and all that. And look, isn't he just great? Well, he's in the middle of a freaking Civil War. He does not know how that's going to come out. But in the midst of that moment of not knowing how that's going to come out and recognizing that literally hundreds of thousands of people are dying on both sides, and people are starving, and it's not at all clear that the United States government is going to survive. He doesn't say, okay, I'm going to compromise. I'm going to go ahead and make these concessions. He does some of that to try and keep his political coalition together. But he says, excuse me, damn it, this is worth it. And it's worth trying to figure out how to do it right. Now, did he get it right? No. Have we ever really gotten it right? No. But we could. And that, it seems to me, is, worth holding in your hearts as something that is worth fighting for. And I don't mean literally necessarily fighting, certainly at this point, but of saying, all right, I'm really tired of listening to what Trump is saying. People ask how I keep my spirits up. I read a lot of stuff. It sucks to watch those videos of Paul Gosar or whatever, but it's worth having some skin in the game to try and make sure the good guys win. So anyway, that's my preaching for today. And I want to get right into tonight because there's a lot of exciting stuff happening. And I have to give another lecture for schools. So thank you for being here. And you'll read to me tonight. And I will see you, I think Thursday. I have to look at my calendar. But I actually, because it's the end of the semester, but I actually think I have something cool planned coming up. Maybe not this week, but coming up. So hold that in your minds. All right, thank you for being here. And I will catch you tonight.